Hello everybody and welcome back to my A to C Stitch with Me's. There has been a long break because last year I had Bunad, and then when that was done I couldn't get access to this cross-stitching project easily. So it was a half day's work just to be able to get this back out. But I found it, and now I'm ready to start on the A to C Stitch with Me again. So let's get going. We're getting close. This is the third part I'm doing, called Snowy Reindeer. It's number 8 in the series, Frosty Forest series by Cottage Needleworks. I'm using all of the called for color and floss. I talk more about that in the first episodes of this series. And yeah, let's just get back to stitching, shall we? So it's been a while and I am struggling to remember exactly what I was doing and what I had planned. So we will just roll with it. And yeah, take it from there. So first off, I thought we could bring out some color instead of just white. And this is how I usually store my floss, is on bobbins. And I will just take I cut off a length of a time where I actually measure the lengths so I get them exactly the way I like. Don't worry, I have an easy way to do that, and it's double the size of what I use because I'm stitching 2/2. And if you don't know what that means, I can't show you that in a second. So I will take the two ends together, fold, it makes on the other end a little loop. And then I can start stitching. So I will zoom you in so you can see a little bit better what I am doing. And I just realized this is bad setup because I couldn't get my hand underneath. I'm stitching two-handed. So 2/2 means 2 flosses of 2 strands of floss over 2 fabric strands. And if you can see, from here to here there is 2 fabric strands. So we have 1 and then 2 I went over, and then you go 1 and 2 up because you're making an X. And since I'm doing the loop start, I take the loop and put my needle in between and then pull, because then it's secure. I go down where I came up, and that way you can start the loop method on the front. So yeah, 2/2 means 2 strands of floss over 2 fabric strands, And if you think about it like a tic-tac-toe board, you kind of use the corners of a tic-tac-toe board to where you're supposed to stitch. And now, as you can see, if you can see it, but there's 2 strands down here. So this square right here is gonna be a stitch, and I park in the bottom middle section when I'm stitching on linen or even weave, because then the floss is never bothering me when I have them parked. And I park on everything. Parking is basically you put the floss in front of your fabric. You don't want to have it on the back because then it will end up getting tangled into the stitches you're doing. But you leave it hanging on the front of the fabric so you can pick it up later when it's a better time to stitch those stitches. Because I like to stitch top down, so I usually will not do the stitches unless I have done the stitches above that's supposed to be done. If there's no stitches above, then I very often can just go ahead and do those stitches, unless I want to use the stitches to pin stitch or something, but that's not a necessity, just something I like to do. So the border here on this pattern, as you can see, there's no stitches right above, but there's stitches in this area where we're stitching. This is how the project is gonna, or this section is looking like. So usually sometimes I will not do this border even though I could, just because I then can pin stitch when I'm stitching these rows down here if I want to. I don't tend to do this on this project, but I'm gonna leave the borders for last because my thinking was when I'm doing the borders, I'm gonna speed the videos up. So that brain of thought totally lost me. Yeah, I will speed things up so it goes quicker, because those borders you have seen done before. So if you want to see more border stitching, you just need to go back and you will get a lot of it. So yeah, the only border I'm not gonna do right away is going to be the middle one, because that's a little bit different than the others. So, yeah. And for some reason, I have been tightening this project, and it still gets very loose. I don't know why suddenly it will not tighten as well. When I wasn't working on this, I didn't have the frame tight at all. Everything was loosened up. So that's not the issue. Let's see if I can get it a little bit tighter, because I usually tend to work on my fabric being really taut. And it just doesn't want to play along, apparently. So it might be I need to place the fabric differently on the frame, because sometimes it gets looser because of where I'm stitching. But we'll see. And I have to say, it's really nice being back to stitching on this project again. It's been way too long. So yeah, really glad. And I think I said this one is called Snowy Deer, but that's actually not the name I remember just now. It's Snowy Reindeer is this one. On the other side, over there, that's where the Snowy Deer section is. That's pattern number 2 that I did. Change needles, because the one I usually stitch this project with is one of the Easy Guide needles. Don't know if the camera will pick it up, and I'm holding it the wrong way, of course. There, you can see the ballpoint tip. So when I'm doing pin stitching, the whole purpose of doing a pin stitch is to actually pierce the floss, and the ballpoint tip is made so you don't pierce the floss. I know people do pin stitch with the ballpoint top, but I don't, because I don't feel it gets secure. So instead, I'm switching to a tapestry needle where I can easily pierce the floss. So it gets nice and secure, and if I ever need to frog, that's gonna be a pain to rip up. A lot of people I have heard doesn't think the pin stitch is very secure, but believe me, if you ever have had to frog a pin stitch that is done correctly, you know it's hard to get that out. So you know it's secure. I'm gonna zoom you a little bit out because I need, in the camera, you're gonna get out of still hope it's okay, but you will get out of frame when stitching this white right here. So we're back in black, or back in white, stitching. And most of the techniques I am using when stitching, I try to explain as best as I can throughout the videos. So when there's something I don't explain, it's because I usually have explained it before. And like the what's over two stitching, that's something I have explained before. So yeah, this is if you just kind of want to see my method of stitching and get an explanation of how I do things, this is usually the video for you, the series. I know a lot of you have been glad to learn the pin stitch method when I have shown the pin stitch method. And yeah, I'm stopping because I'm not sure if I like how this is looking when I'm doing the every other stitch. A lot of the time I will not jump at all. I will do it this time and then just see if I can make it look good. When I'm doing the next row, because as you can see, the brown stitches kind of disappears in between the white ones now. So I'm not sure if I like this at all. So I'm gonna frog because I don't like this. The brown stitches disappear too much and I don't want that. I don't want the yes, I'm very particular about how I do my stitches and how they look. And that's me. You don't have to do this. You don't have to be like that. It's just me, and that's how I like to stitch. I like stitching when all of my stitches looks nice. So there actually has been one of the projects that I ended up UFOing last year was actually because mainly there was several reasons, but I found eventually that because of how the stitches look, I didn't like it at all. I had started in the middle and was stitching my way up, so that was an issue. But I also didn't like how the stitches would look. Because the recommended fabric was an 18 count or a 36 count. And it's supposed to have beads and stuff. And it was a hand-dyed 18 count. And you had to stitch over two because there was blended floss. And the stitches just didn't look good. They 18 count, yes, you can do over two, but not on a hand dyed if it has shrunk a lot. And the one I had shrunk a lot. So that was my Esmeralda by Pinky the Pink. So if that's ever being, it's gonna be restarted eventually. I just don't think it will be this year. So when it's eventually restarted, it's gonna be on a 32 count and not a 36 count. This is a 32 count, and stitching 32 count over 2, in my opinion, you get really perfect coverage for patterns like this. On full coverage projects, you usually don't want to stitch over 2, but 18 count is like the same equivalent. No, 16 count is the same equivalent on a full coverage, and then it can be a little bit too sparse if you're using a lot of darker floss. But one, that's not a problem on this project. You don't have a lot of darker floss, and also it's not full coverage. But I do know people that stitch on full coverage on 16 count with 2 strands, and it looks really nice. I just know even when I stitch on 18 count with 2 strands, it gets almost too sparse for me when it's full coverage, because I like it to be almost as bulky as it gets when stitching full coverage. And I don't like any fabric to show through at all. And because I have a very tight tension, 2 strands doesn't tend to be enough for me. Because that's also a good point when it comes to stitching, is that people have different tension, and that makes a difference. And how many strands you should use, and what's a good fabric for you to use with that amount of strands. So I know stitching Jules, at least before, she did a lot of projects on 14 count with 2 strands, and it looks amazing when she's stitching it. But I know if that was me, it wouldn't look good. Like on my 14 count, I needed to have 3 strands, while she can have 2 strands on 14 count, and it looks perfect. Well, mine didn't, so I went with 3 strands. And that's the Epic Pokemon project I finished. I did on 3 strands on 14 count. Ida. And I did kind of count the just an estimate on how many stitches there are left. And I was like, oh, this is soon gonna be finished. It's like 1 or 2 videos. And then I did an estimate of how many stitches there are left. And I found that it's how did I do that mistake? Go up in the middle of the white stitch. Yeah, I found that there's over 500 stitches left just in this big snowy hill the reindeers are standing on. So no, when doing stitch with me's, I do stitch a lot slower than usual, especially when I'm talking. So 500 stitches I'm not gonna get done in. Usually my videos are about 30 minutes of stitching to 45 minutes of stitching. And in that time span, usually I could get like 150 stitches if I wasn't filming. Maybe even 200 if it's not too many different colors. And just stitching normal speed. But I'm not able to do 500 in that amount of time. Even though my record during 500 stitches when I was, and then I'm speed stitching. I'm not filming, I'm usually only stitching 1, maybe 2, 3 different colors. Nothing else. Then I can do 500 stitches just under an hour. And I'm not doing any of those things right now. Except for stitching just a few colors. And what I just did is I did the pin stitch. Did I do the pin stitch underneath? I'm gonna do one more just, yeah, I did the pin stitch. I can feel resistance going down. That's my biggest problem on camera. I forget what I was doing or what I just did. So. I'm gonna leave the floss hanging around my snowflake needle minder. That's a new thing I have been starting with, the floss that has been cut off that I know I'm going to use later. I just hang on my needle minder on my project because then when I need that color again, I just pick it up. Basically, that's all I do. I just pick it up. This is one of, so this length I have in a floss away bag. And what I originally did was I would just pull out the lengths and cut them with my ruler that I use to measure up. But on this length, I actually folded 4 times. So you get 8 lengths the same size, and I cut it in one end. So now, because one skein is 8 meters, so each length is now 1 meter. It's a little bit shorter than what I usually like to work with. But it's nice having them pre-cut all of the lengths. So then I can just take out one length and I take one strand out. And then I wrap it around 2 fingers, the length that I have started to use from. And I just put it in the bag. So next time I know this is the one I'm taking my lengths from. It's easy access. So and yes, on project where I park, I will often start multiple lengths of the same color if it fits the way I'm stitching. And this one does. So I was actually supposed to have 4 stitches here, so I need to do one more at the end, right here. And you might have noticed what I'm also have started to do. I didn't realize I was doing this until recently, so I don't know when I started with it. But when I go down, I take my needle under the floss and then go down the hole, and this tends to make it so the floss doesn't twist too much on me and lay more nicely in the holes without railroading. Railroading is when you take the needle between the 2 strands like this and then go down the hole. You can also use a laying tool. I don't have that, but the principle of a laying tool is that you will use a tool to hold the length of the floss, and when you go down, you kind of lay the floss down with the end, and it makes it so the 2 strands lay nicely beside each other going down. So. What also helps is when I end my parking, I usually take my fingers over the floss and straighten it out. So if it has, in that amount of time I have been using it, if it has started to curl up, it will be straightened out again. And as this time I'm stitching back and then forth with my stitches is because I'm gonna end off on this side. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And right now, if you have seen, a lot of the time I will be doing one stitch at a time. It's because I have been stitching on 3 projects in a row that has variegated floss, and then you have to do one stitch at a time. So I have been so used to doing one stitch at a time that I kind of need to learn how I did them. Big blocks of color. So that's why you sometimes see me do one stitch and then I do half stitches one direction and then go back and complete the stitches the next direction. Because my stitches looks nicer when I do this method instead of one at a time. Like, they look good going from left to right, doing one stitch at a time, but going right to left, that's when they start to look wonky if I do one stitch at a time. I do try to avoid having my stitches look wonky. And it's okay when I'm doing variegated floss because you kind of have to, and I don't do, a lot of the time I don't do straight lines. I stitch a little bit differently. So you don't get like one row that looks perfect and then the next row looks wonky and then one row that looks perfect and then one row that looks wonky. Because that's what happened if we try to do one stitch at a time on a project like this. It's starting to look nice with all the pine cones on the ground. I do love how this project is looking. Done. So there I did the pin stitch under the stitch again. And that's kind of hard to see how I'm doing a pin stitch. But now I'm going to do a pin stitch without it being under a stitch, so that's when it's easier to see. So I go down in the middle, straight in middle. If you're doing it on Ada, you will pierce that middle. And then I leave a little tail. What I did there was a little knot on the back that I could feel. Also, when I tried to pull, this length wouldn't go down. Something was making it stuck, so it felt like I couldn't move the length anymore. So I knew there was a knot on the back. So I just pulled it a little bit back and forth, and that got the knot back away. So I leave a little tail and I will hold it with my fingers. I went up in the middle, top middle of the tic-tac board, and then I will go down. And I will purposely try and pierce the floss going down. And then I'll let the tail go in the other direction. And I will go to the opposite side. So bottom to the bottom middle, and then down straight the middle again. This is the stitch. When I do it this way, you get that extra pin. So now I'm pulling really hard, and you can see it's secure. And when I do it from one from each side, the stitch above looks nicer. If I only do from one side, if I do, some people just do one pin, I always do two, because that first one doesn't always keep it in place. And even, especially if I'm working with silk, I will do a third time, because silk can tend to slip a little bit. So I cut away that little tail. As you saw, this floss is nice and secure. Like I'm pulling. Then you can go ahead and do the stitch above. And now I'm gonna trail down with half stitches, because the next stitches is gonna be over here. So I'm trailing down, and I will complete the stitches going up, and this is the perfect direction to trail down. The way I do my stitches is down to the left. If I go down to the right, the stitches doesn't always look 100% perfect going back, but they do if I go down or if I go up. And now I will do a little pin stitch just to control where my stitch are, because I'm jumping over that stitch, and sometimes it's fine just jumping, and other times, especially on this fabric, especially on linen, I kind of need to be more careful, because it's so easy to make the stitches look wonky, and I don't like that. I feel like we have talked about that before. I don't like wonky stitches. If you have wonky stitches on your project, I don't care. I just don't want them on my project. Because that's just the way I am. I like things a certain way. And if I start to have clunky stitches or wonky stitches, I actually tend to end up disliking the project if I'm struggling to have nice looking stitches. And yes, I know I started with one stitch, and then that was, this time was a purpose behind it, because I'm working my way over here, and I trail off to do those two stitches because I want to do them before going the direction I am. So a lot of the time I do have a purpose behind how I do all the stitching, especially when I start to do one stitch at a time like now, because now there's 2 stitches here, and one of them is right here, so it's the top right diagonally up from this stitch, and the floss on the back doesn't jump long way ahead, so, and it doesn't get that elongated foot that I have talked about before, or leg, not foot, leg of the stitch. Because what can happen is if I go down here, if I go down this way with the floss, you see it wraps around and go down. If I don't do that, say I was jumping up and doing a stitch over here suddenly, you can see that that leg suddenly gets longer. It gets elongated. And I don't like that. So it's important for me that the leg always wrap around one of the fabric threads. Because then I think it looks nicer. So, all right, it's been 46 minutes. My son is soon home from school, so I need to go and open the door and do homework and all that mommy stuff. And it's his second week back, and he have gotten some new type of homework. Like usually the homework has been very similar, like throughout the year, the last half year, and suddenly now they're not. So I'm struggling to do homework with him because he's like his mom. He doesn't like a lot of changes. So, but once we get into the rhythm, hopefully the homework will stay somewhat similar. He's gonna think it's fine. He just needs some time to readjust. So yeah. Thank you all so much for coming, watching. If you like this series, then please leave a like and thumbs up, a comment, all that good stuff, so I know that this is something you want me to keep doing, because it takes a lot of time. There's a lot of behind the scenes setup to get this filmed. So yeah, if you do like this series, then please leave a comment and a thumbs up, so I know that you do like it and want me to keep going. So next time, we're gonna work more on this hill, doing more snow and pine cones until it's eventually done. And when it's done, that's when I can start doing the last part of the border and do the other 2 borders. I'm not going to do that in the middle because that's different. So it's going to be this border down here and this over here. I don't think I will do the 3rd row of patterns that's down here. I will do those when I get down. So yeah, and we did a vote on where you wanted me to stitch next. You could decide about number 3, 9, or 7. That's the number in the series of the pattern, and people went with number 7, the one right under here, the one I wanted the most. So I'm so very happy to see that people agree with my with what I want. So yeah, most likely I'm gonna then do this section, and then this section. Then we'll jump down to the last row and we go the same direction. And that's just how I'm going to do it. So yeah, try to zoom out so you could see the whole thing. Here you can see that floss I talked about being parked. So thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week, hopefully, if things goes to plan. Goodbye, everyone.